did you report estimated frequencies? In other words, estimates of how rare matching characteristics are in the three major racial groups you've described?
Yes, we did.
Now, as far as those estimates, can you or will you be able to tell us basically the range, that is, amongst those three groups as far as a set of characteristics on a sample, let's say, which is the most common group, that is the group with the most common estimate, versus the group with the least common or rarest estimate?
Yes.
Would that then, by doing so, represent the range of rarity of matching characteristics?
Yes.
Overruled. Now, Your Honor, at this time I'd like to return to the Bundy Crime Scene Results Board, Exhibit 259.
All right. And let me see counsel at sidebar with report of course. All right, thank you, counsel. Proceed.
All right, Dr. Cotton, referring you to the board that's been marked People's Exhibit 259, in particular, item 47, first drop by the victims at Bundy.
Yes.
Did you in fact calculate an estimate of the rarity of individuals having the characteristics or those genetic marker types at the 6 markers, DQ alpha plus the poly markers, and Mr. Simpson?
Yes, we did.
Did you in fact, in doing so, use these 3 racial categories?
Yes, we did.
And did they present you with, well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Did you then obtain estimates that ranged from a low for one group, whatever that group may be, to a high for another group, whatever remaining group that is?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Can you then describe, may I have just a moment, Your Honor? Can you describe for us, with regard to this evidence item, approximately how rare those characteristics are that are shared by that blood stain and Mr. Simpson, and start with whatever group you would be easiest to and tell us that approximation? Does that make any sense?
What do you mean start with whatever group?
Well, let's start with Caucasians, for instance.
Oh, I see. Okay. And we're working on item 47, right?
Correct, and this
Okay.
would be using the DQ alpha and poly markers.
Did you want me to just give the most common and the most rare?
Let's start with the most common.
The most common would be for African Americans, and that would be 1 in 5,000, approximately 5,200.
I'm going to have you write those on the board if you would in just a moment, but could you tell us the group that would be the next most common?
The next most common would be Hispanic, and that figure would be that that set of types was found in approximately 1 in every 32,000 Hispanics.
And then what would be the rarest racial group as far as these characteristics?
For these set of characteristics, the most rare frequency that we determined was for Caucasians, and it would be 1 in 56,000.
All right, Dr. Cotton, with the court's permission, I'm going to ask you to write to the far right of item 47 under the column marked frequency and start with the most common estimate in terms of the racial group wherein these characteristics are most common, and if you would write that number, then write in the word 2 just to indicate the range, and then the least common or rarest calculation or estimate you just provided.
Okay.
And I have a red pen if that would help. Is that diagram low enough for you to write on?
Yes.
All right.
May not be steady enough. Mr. Fairlow, do you want to hold on to that, please?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Clarke.
All right, Dr. Cotton, we'll move a little faster with the succeeding ones, but I want to ask you a couple of questions first. When you have provided this range of from 1 in 5,200 people to approximately 1 in 56,000 people, is that simply an estimate across these 3 racial groups of approximately how common or rare these DNA types are that are shared by this blood stain and Mr. Simpson?
Yes, you've stated it exactly right.
Turning your attention now to the Bundy walk stain, item number 48. First of all, were those results as far as DQ alpha and polymarker is concerned the same as item 47?
Yes, they were.
All right, and perhaps we can make this a little faster. Is that also true as to the other Bundy walk stains as far as PCR testing is concerned, items number 49, 50, and 52?
Yes.
All right, what I'm going to ask you to do then, Dr. Cotton, is as to those 4 items, 48, 49, 50, and 52, the Bundy walk stains, would you again place those frequencies in the appropriate boxes for your PCR testing at Cellmark?
Yes.
All right, could you go ahead and do so? And on 52, if you can wait just a moment, I believe there's 2 rows there, and I believe it would be the lower row for PCR. Your Honor, may we remove that marker?
Yes.
And if you could, in a somewhat smaller box, write that in. Thank you, Dr. Cotton. As to these PCR results, if any of these stains were also tested at an additional marker after using PCR, and that marker was independent of the 6 that you tested at Cellmark, if those characteristics matched, Mr. Simpson, would the estimate be rarer?
Yes.
Why?
If you take these figures and you add in yet another genetic marker, you're going to be multiplying some frequency, which will be less than 1, and then taking the inverse, which is how you get the 1 in some number. And that will mean it will of necessity make these numbers more rare.
Turning your attention again to the Bundy stain, item number 52, did you also calculate an estimate of the frequency for the RFLP matching characteristics to Mr. Simpson at 5 different probes?
Yes, we did.
Did that also, or have you also reported an estimate across these 3 different racial or ethnic groups?
Yes, we have.
All right, could you again describe, first orally, in what group those characteristics were most common?
If you'll just give me a minute.
Sure.
The RFLP pattern from item 52, when that was used to calculate a frequency, the frequency that is calculated for African Americans and Caucasians is the same, and those estimations are that that set of characteristics would occur in approximately 1 in 170 million individuals. The frequency for Western Hispanics is more rare than that, and that frequency is that same set of RFLP characteristics would occur in approximately 1 in 1.2 billion.
1.2 billion?
Yes.
Now, as far as that estimate for African Americans and Caucasians, does that mean that these characteristics that Mr. Simpson has that are also found in the Bundy Walk bloodstain are only found in approximately 1 out of 170 million Caucasians or African Americans?
Yes, approximately.
All right, if you would then, with that stain, and there's a little box just above the last PCR box you wrote in that will describe RFLP, could you write in that range, the high and the low? Dr. Cotton, the difference in the numbers between those estimates provided by PCR and the estimates that you've just provided as a result of the RFLP matches with Mr. Simpson seem to be quite a bit different mathematically. Is that right?
Yes, they're very different.
Why is that?
The RFLP markers have a much, much greater level of variation in the population than the PCR markers. If you had to make them sort of in order, the RFLP markers would be at way one end of the continuum, then you'd sort of move down a ways and you'd see DQ alpha, and then you'd move down yet further, and if you looked at the individual markers that are part of the polymarker system, they're not very informative individually. That's why you use them as a group of 5. So the RFLP is much more discriminating of a test in terms of separating human beings one from the other.
Now let's turn, if we can, to the shoe print, number 56. And that included results at both DQ alpha and the 5 polymarkers, correct?
Yes.
Now the DQ...
No, we didn't include the DQ alpha frequency.
That's just what I was going to ask next. As far as the DQ alpha result that's written in, those were the types you observed on the shoe print, 1.1, 1.1, correct? As far as actual types that were detected.
As far as the actual types observed, yes.
Now, because there was no C dot or control dot, do you use that result for DQ alpha in calculating an approximate or estimate of the frequencies of individuals who have those polymarker or DQ alpha characteristics?
No, we did not include it in the calculation of the frequency. We only used the information from the polymarker where we did get an appropriate control dot.
Is that to ensure that when you provide these estimates, you're only doing it for markers and tests that have worked properly?
Yes.
Oh, well,
Now, did you calculate an approximate or an estimate of the frequency of the polymarker characteristics that are shared by the shoe print and Nicole Brown?
Yes, we did.
Could you describe those for us?
Yes, but you'll have to let me find it.
Fine.
Okay.
Could you describe them first?
The 3 numbers.
Yes, the most common, the most common through to the most rare.
Okay. For that set of types for the polymarker, the most common frequency was in Caucasians, and that number was 1 in 48. The middle frequency was that for Hispanics, and that number was 1 in 110. And the rarest frequency of that group was for African Americans, and that was 1 in 610. And these, again, whenever I say 1 in something, if I don't say approximately 1 in something, I should be. That's what I mean to be saying.
In other words, you're not offering, or your laboratory doesn't offer, that when an estimate is made of 1 out of 100, let's say, that if one examined 100 people, one would find one person with these characteristics, went to another group, and out of 100 would find these characteristics once and only once.
That's what the probability is telling you, but in reality, it might be slightly different than that. It might be you might find 2 in 100 or none in 100.
All right. Could you then, with respect to the shoe print, then write in those frequency ranges that you just described? Now, item 78, the boot drop, you described that as a mixture, correct?
Yes.
All right, let's turn now then to 84A, the left nail clippings and scrapings. And you described the fact that at the DQ alpha marker and polymarkers, that those characteristics were consistent with Nicole Brown.
Yes.
Did you calculate frequencies for that combination of markers?
Yes, we did.
Can you describe them in the way that you have previously?
Yes. You have to give me just a second.
All right.
Okay.
And these are estimates that you made based on your DQ alpha results and polymarker results.
That's right.
Could you then describe that for 84A?
They're going to be all the same figure for the various 84 things.
In other words, 84A as well as the two samples from 84B, the right-hand nail clippings and scrapings, your laboratory obtained the same results for all three.
That's right.
All right. Could you then describe them?
The most common figure for that combination of types is approximately 1 in 2,500. The middle range frequency comes out to be the one for Hispanics, and that's approximately 1 in 7,300. And the most rare comes out to be the one for African Americans for this combination, and that's 1 in 26,000.
Could you then, in the three locations for item number 48, the fingernail clippings and scrapings, could you write in that range in the three locations under frequency?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Cotton. Now, why is there a difference in these estimates between that of the shoe print, number 56, which match Nicole Brown, and the estimates for the fingernail clippings and scrapings that also match Nicole Brown?
The difference is that for the fingernail clippings and scrapings, that information includes the DQ alpha frequencies. And for the shoe print, that does not.
If the shoe print control dot had appeared properly and the types had shown as they appeared to you even without the control dot, would the estimated frequency for the shoe print then be the same as that for the fingernail clippings and scrapings?
Sustained.
In any event, the DQ alpha, there's the fact that there was no result on the shoe print is what makes these frequencies different.
Yes.
All right, Your Honor, at this time I'd like to turn to what's been marked People's Exhibit 261, the Rockingham results. All right. Dr. Cotton, if you would, and I'm referring you to what's the Rockingham driveway stain, item number 7.
Yes.
Did you calculate a frequency for those characteristics that are consistent with Mr. Simpson from that blood stain?
Yes, we did.
And was that for polymarker alone because of the absence of a C dot on the DQ alpha results?
That's right.
Okay, could you describe that for us, please?
I have to find it. Okay.
And what are those estimates?
The estimates range from the most common being for African Americans, approximately 1 in 410. The middle range happens to be in this case for Hispanics with 1 in 1,500, 1,500. And the most rare comes out to be for Caucasians, and that's approximately 1 in 3,400.
All right, would you on the board that's been marked People's Exhibit
261.
Thank you. Then write that range next to, or at the far end of that Rockingham stain number 7. And then as to the last result on this board, referring you to the stain from the Rockingham foyer, number 12, you obtained both RFLP and PCR results, correct?
Yes, we did.
As far as this 5-probe match using the RFLP technique, did you calculate an estimate of the approximate rarity of those characteristics that match Mr. Simpson using RFLP typing?
Yes, we did.
Would that be the same or different from the earlier results from the Bundy crime scene, item number 52, at which Mr. Simpson matched that Bundy stain as well?
It's the same.
All right. Could you just then repeat it by writing it on the board again? Now, Dr. Cotton, you have written in as to the estimations of how rare these matching characteristics are between the blood stain from the Rockingham foyer that matches Mr. Simpson as between approximately 1 in 170 million and 1 in 1.2 billion. Is that right?
That's right.
And is that the same result again in terms of these estimates as the blood stain number 52 at Bundy?
Yes, it is.
Now, did you also perform PCR typing on this same Rockingham foyer stain and estimated how rare those characteristics are that are shared with Mr. Simpson?
For the PCR types?
Yes.
Yes, we did.
In this instance, unlike number 7, did you also have a DQ alpha result?
Yes, we did.
All right. Could you describe for us the relative rarity of these characteristics that are consistent with Mr. Simpson using PCR typing?
Yes. Those results come out to be the most common frequency for that group of types is in African Americans, and that figure is approximately 1 in 5,200. The mid-range frequency comes out to be the one for Hispanics, and that's approximately 1 in 32,000. And the most rare frequency for that group of types comes out to be the one for Caucasians, and that's 1 in 56,000.
Now, are these estimates the same as with the Bundy crime scene estimate stains that were consistent with Mr. Simpson using PCR?
Yes, they are.
All right. Could you then go ahead and write those numbers under the PCR portion of item number 12, the Rockingham foyer stains. Now, lastly, Dr. Cotton, what I'm going to ask is that the last result board be used, which is People's Exhibit 262. And I'm going to refer you to the one result, or one evidence item rather, that you've described earlier, the socks. Do you have in the material before you your approximations of how common or how rare the matching characteristics are shared by the sock and Nicole Brown?
Yes, I do.
With respect to your RFLP typing and the 5-probe match, can you describe for the jury, please, approximately how rare those characteristics are shared by the sock and Nicole Brown?
For the RFLP results, the range of numbers goes from the most, the most common being the approximation for Western Hispanics, and that is 1 in 6.8 billion. The mid-range figure is for Caucasians, and that number is approximately 1 in 9.7 billion. And the figure that would be most rare is for African Americans, and that number is 1 in 530 billion.
All right, Dr. Cotton, could you on the board, and referring to again the exhibit, People's Exhibit 262, write in that range for the 5-probe match between Nicole Brown and the sock? Next to what's been labeled RFLP under the frequency column. All right, Dr. Cotton, you have written in under frequencies 1 in 6.8 billion to 1 in 530 billion. Is that right?
Yes.
How many people are on Earth?
Well, I don't personally know, but the figure I've been quoted is about 5 billion, I think.
What do these results mean then?
Sustained.
Did you also calculate a frequency just based on your PCR typing of the sock as well?
Yes, we did.
And could you describe that for us?
Yes, just 1 second. Based on the PCR types alone, the figures come out as follows. The most common is for Caucasians, and that figure is 1 in approximately 2,500. Mid-range frequency is for Hispanics, and that number is 1 in approximately 7,300. And the most rare type comes out to be the one for African Americans, and that's approximately 1 in 26,000.
Are these the same estimates on the earlier samples using PCR that were consistent with Nicole Brown, such as the fingernails?
Yes.
All right, and lastly, could you just write those numbers under PCR for the sock? And again, these were 6 different genetic markers using PCR, then the 5 markers used to type this sample using the RFLP process.
Yes.
All right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the morning session. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Do not discuss this case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until 1 o'clock. All right, Dr. Cotton. All right, Dr. Cotton, would you resume the witness stand, please? Good afternoon again, Dr. Cotton.
Good afternoon.
You're reminded you were still under oath, and Mr. Clarke, you may conclude your direct examination.
I shall. Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Cotton, following the end, or when you concluded testing on different pieces of evidence, would they be returned to the original agency that sent them to you?
Yes.
And as far as evidence in this case was concerned, did the bulk of it, was the bulk of it returned to the Los Angeles Police Department?
Yes.
Did you release a couple of pieces, at least 2 pieces of evidence to another laboratory?
Yes, we did.
All right, in particular, can you tell us with regard to the Bundy bloodstain, item number 52, can you tell us when it was released?
It was released on October 13th, 1994,
To the custody of any particular individual?
to the custody of Michael Stevens.
Do you know who Michael Stevens is?
In parentheses, it has LADA. I assume that stands for Los Angeles District Attorney's Office.
All right, with regard to this Bundy stain, item 52, can you describe for us, please, exactly what was released to his custody?
Yes, but you'll have to wait 1 second.
All right.
It would have been the 10% cuttings from the 2 bloodstains that comprise that item.
So this would have been, as far as this particular evidence, item 52, the Bundy bloodstain was concerned, would have been 2 of those little cuttings, the smaller or 10% or approximate 10% portions?
Yes,
And that would have been 2 separate cuttings, but from the same evidence swatches.
that's right.
Were those the cuttings made by Dr. Blake?
Yes, they were.
On that date, did you also release to Mr. Stevens anything with regard to number 78, the boot stain?
Yes, we did.
What was that?
And hang on just 1 minute. That would have been the 10% cutting from that also.
Again, also, that would be a single 10% cutting?
Yes,
And was that also the cutting done by Dr. Blake?
yes.
As far as the Department of Justice was concerned, did you at some time provide them with any photographs of your product gels?
Yes, we did.
Did you also provide them photographs of your yield gels?
Yes, we did. That's sort of the same thing.
In what way?
Product gel is synonymous with yield gel. We provided them a picture of that gel, but it's the same. You've used 2 terms to describe the same thing.
Okay. Are these gels that you look at to see if the DNA has amplified?
Oh, okay. Never mind. I'm sorry. Product gel being the gel, we haven't actually talked about that, but you can run a small gel to see if your DNA is amplified, and yes, product gel in that sense is different from yield gel, and we did provide that, both of them.
Both types to the Department of
Yes.
Justice? Now, Dr. Cotton, to your knowledge, have all the records, raw data, or copies of the raw data, and photographs in this case from your laboratory been provided to the defense?
Yes.
Do you know of any case in your laboratory where the volume of materials provided to the defense has been more extensive than this case?
Sustained.
Did you provide the defense your population databases?
Yes, we did.
Did you provide them your written protocols and manuals?
Yes, we did.
Dr. Cotton, as a result of the testing and the results you've described at your laboratory, Are there any questions in your mind about the accuracy of the results reported by your laboratory in this case?
No, there are not.
All right, thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Neufeld, do you need a moment?
I need some time just to
All right.
set up and
All right.
move things around.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, when we switch from direct examination to cross-examination, I normally take a break to allow the lawyers to shift their exhibits and things and get organized. So we'll take probably about 10 or 15 minutes. Let me ask you to step back into the jury room. I came up with an application error. Ready? All right, let's have the jury, please. Mr. Neufeld,
I'm sorry, what, Your Honor?
what kind of board is this? What kind of a board is this? How do you propose we preserve that for the record?
We have Howard Harris can take a photograph of it.
All right.
All rise.
Seated. Dr. Cotton, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, Mr. Clarke, as to the items presented thus far, you've completed your direct examination subject to the reopening, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Neufeld, you may commence your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Dr. Cotton.
Good afternoon.
Now, Dr. Cotton, on direct examination, you were asked repeatedly during the direct examination whether or not degradation, okay, the process of degradation could change one person's DNA into another. And I believe that each time you answered that question, you said no. Is that right?
That's right.
And by the way, have you been following this trial at all?
I've watched part of the opening arguments and then bits and pieces of testimony and maybe 30 minutes here and there as the trial's gone along.
Okay. Have you at all, at any time during these proceedings that you've followed, Dr. Cotton, ever heard either Mr. Blazer, Mr. Scheck, or myself suggest to any witnesses at all that through the process of degradation, a person's blood could change from one person to another?
Sustained.
Well, let me ask you a hypothetical, Dr. Cotton. I'd like you to assume for a moment that the blood drops that were recovered from Bundy did not come from Mr. Simpson, but instead come from some other person. And I'd also like you to assume for the purpose of this hypothetical that the blood drops recovered at Rockingham are indeed Mr. Simpson's blood. All right?
Okay.
Thank you. Now, I'd also like you to assume, for the purpose of this hypothetical, that due to the manner in which the Bundy blood drops were collected, packaged, and processed, that they became degraded. Okay?
Okay.
And in fact, you've described, I think, in detail during direct examination how blood stains or blood drops can become degraded. Isn't that right?
Yes.
For instance, in this case, you mentioned that the...
Excuse me, counsel. We're going to have to move this easel because it's blocking two of the jurors' view
Oh,
of Dr.
okay.
Cotton. Right. Thank you, counsel. Proceed.
For instance, you mentioned during direct examination that item 56, I'm asking that item 56, which is exhibit number 256, go up on the Elmo. And I believe, if you would, if you could stand and just use the pointer to point out to the jury where lane 56 is again.
Down here, you mean?
Well,
Yeah.
actually, come over. Come over to 56 to the left. No, back up one. The blank ones. There. Okay. Is that the lane of reflecting a DNA test on item 56?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And as you can see, and I believe as you testified, that lane is clear, right?
That's right.
And that's an indication that the DNA from that sample degraded considerably. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, here's a picture. Yeah. And when you first looked at item 56 in the laboratory, before you even looked at it on the level of DNA, you just saw these swatches, you couldn't tell just from looking at it that the DNA was degraded. Isn't that right?
Of course.
And to the naked eye, in fact, it didn't look any different than item 52, for instance, did it?
That's right.
Now, I'll get to it in a second. Now, what I'd like you to assume, ma'am, doctor, excuse me.
Either
Well-
way is fine.
Okay. What I'd like you to assume, Dr. Cotton, is that those drops from Bundy, which were not left by Mr. Simpson, but became degraded in the packaging or handling process, such that all the DNA that was in that sample and on those swatches was completely lost to degradation. Okay?
Okay.
Now what I'd like you to assume is that when those swatches from the Bundy drops get back to the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory, they are brought into contact with the swatches from Rockingham, which I've already asked you to assume came from Mr. Simpson. Okay?
Okay.
And that the Rockingham drops, or at least some of them, such as item number 12, were not very degraded. Okay?
That's right.
I believe you even said on direct examination that item 12 seemed to be in good shape, relatively speaking.
It does.
And so there was a lot more DNA on item 12 than there was, for instance, on item 52. Is that right?
That's right.
In fact, there was a lot more DNA on item 12, which comes from Mr. Simpson's FOIA, than there was on any of the drops from Rockingham. Isn't that right?
That's right.
And what I'd like you to assume for the purpose of this hypothetical, Dr. Cotton, is that these blood drop stains from Bundy, when they're brought back to the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory, came into contact with Rockingham drops, which had more DNA in it, and that those swatches from Rockingham cross-contaminated, by accident, the swatches from Bundy. Okay?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Objection?
Let me see counsel at sidebar, please.
Dr. Cotton, now, just again, because we had a little bit of a break, assuming again that the drops at Bundy were not deposited by Mr. Simpson, but were deposited by someone else, and assume that in the process of collection, processing, and handling and packaging of those drops, that the stains became so degraded as to lose their DNA content, to some extent as it would look like here on item 56. I believe that also happened in your laboratory with respect to item 42, didn't it? That was from the pool of blood near Mrs. Nicole Brown Simpson's body. Did you see that same phenomena?
No foundation.
Overruled. Do you recall that?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Don't you recall that you didn't even see a control dot on item 42?
Sustained.
Well, put aside item 42 then, okay? I just would like you to make this assumption that that degree of degradation occurred, so that the items actually lost their DNA content.
Right, I understand.
Okay, now even when that happens,
I'm sorry, Your Honor, objection, no foundation. Actually misstates the evidence.
Rephrase the question.
I'm asking you to assume, for the purpose of this hypothetical, that the items, the swatches taken from the Bundy blood drops became so degraded as to lose all recognizable DNA. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'm asking you to assume that at a later point in time at the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory, they came into contact inadvertently with swatches from Rockingham that had Mr. Simpson's blood on it and that had more DNA in them. Okay?
Yes.
And I'm asking you to assume that they also came into contact with Mr. Simpson's reference sample, meaning the vial of fresh blood. All right? Just assume those three premises.
Excuse me, Your Honor, objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. No
Yep.
foundation.
Your Honor, the subject.
Sustained. As to that additional item, that's more than we discussed at sidebar. Sustained.
Fine. Limit the hypothetical then to the Bundy swatches coming into contact with the Rockingham swatches. All right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, given those assumptions, is it possible scientifically that when they come into contact with Rockingham swatches, that there can be cross-contamination from Rockingham swatches to the Bundy swatches? Is that scientifically possible?
Are you asking me if it's scientifically possible, or does the state of the DNA in this case support that?
I'm asking you whether it's scientifically possible, Dr. Cotton.
Certainly, I suppose it would be scientifically possible for a very small amount of material to be transferred from one swatch to another.
Okay. Now, Dr. Cotton, furthermore, we're talking about, let me back up again. And if some of the material from the Rockingham swatches that,
Forgive me. Is the auto-rads that are on top of the monitor here, are those evidence?
yes,
Okay. Just don't want you to melt them there.
all right.
Proceed.
If some of the blood from the Rockingham swatches that represent Mr. Simpson's blood came in contact with the swatches from Bundy, which were degraded, so degraded as to not to have any more DNA recognizable, given my hypothetical, excuse me. Under those facts and circumstances, Dr. Cotton, is it possible that the contaminated sample, contaminated by Mr. Simpson's blood, is what you would see if you did a DNA test?
Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence, misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
You'd have to ask me what kind of DNA test before I could answer you.
Okay, well, in the first instance, let me ask you about item 52. Item 52 was a blood drop from Bundy, is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said that, based on your own experience in the laboratory, item 52 appears to have very little DNA in the lane. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And in fact, you mentioned that there is a method that Cellmark has at its disposal to estimate the amount of human DNA in a sample. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And what is that called, Dr. Cotton?
It's referred to as a slot blot, which is just a way to use a probe that's human-specific on a small part of the sample and see how much signal you get and compare that to a whole series of controls of known amounts, and you can make an estimation from that as about how much human DNA that you have, and it has some limitations, but it's very useful.
All right. And did you in fact do a slot blot, in this case, on item 52?
Yes, I believe we did.
And did that slot blot produce a result giving you an estimate as to approximately how much DNA was present in the entire sample?
I'd have to go into the records to tell you.
Please do.
Okay. For this, I'm going to get out the original records since those will be better for me to be looking
Okay.
at.
While you're looking, Dr. Cotton, I'm just going to, with the court's permission, replace the exhibit that's on the Elmo with item 257B, which reflects item 52.
People's 257B.
People's.
Item 52.
People's 257B,
Item 52.
which reflects item 52. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Dr. Cotton, do you have the slot blot?
I have it.
You have looked at it?
I've looked at it, and if you can ask the question again, so.
Okay. Based on your review of the slot blot, is there an estimate as to how much DNA was present, at least in the sample that you did the slot blot on?
From the slot blot, the amount of DNA appears to be about 25 nanograms altogether. However, the slot blot is a separate extraction from the DNA that was extracted that goes on the autorad. There is no slot blot for the DNA that was loaded on the agarose gel, which is what you're seeing on the autorad. The only estimation of that amount of DNA would come from the yield gel or looking at the film itself and making an estimation.
Well, okay, let's just back up a second. The yield gel simply tells you how much DNA is present. It doesn't tell you whether or not it's bacterial DNA or human DNA. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely right.
Right. And you're saying that this slot blot does not represent 10% of the entire sample that you received minus that 10% cut that's saved?
That's what I'm telling you.
All right. What percentage of the entire sample is represented in the slot blot?
About-
Approximately,
About 10%.
of the entire sample.
Well, let me lay it out, and so
Please.
that we won't get confused. 10% of the sample was, and this is an approximation because you're cutting from, an irregularly shaped thing. 10% of the sample was used for the PCR test. The slot blot was done for that 10%. A DNA extraction was done from that 10% of that DNA for the PCR, and of that DNA extraction, 10% of it would have been loaded on the slot blot, so that all we can really say in response to your question is, of the DNA that was extracted for PCR, approximately 25 nanograms would have been available. That is maybe approximately 10% of the entire sample.
All right. Would you agree that the banding pattern, I'm sorry, withdrawing. You said a moment ago that one way to estimate how much DNA is present in the sample is to look at the order rods themselves. Is that correct?
Yes.
And would you agree that there is significantly less DNA present in lane 52 than in any of the reference samples, for instance?
Yes.
And there's significantly less DNA present in 52 than there is in item 12.
Yes.
And what is your target when you are loading lanes to do RFLP typing?
We don't have a specific target, but generally we will not want to go below 25 nanograms.
Well, does your protocol in fact say that you should have at least 50 nanograms?
No, I don't believe it does.
Well, does your protocol say, with respect to the question of how much DNA one can get a result from, say that 50 nanograms of DNA may give an RFLP banding pattern? Does it say that?
I don't have that huge protocol memorized. If
Right.
that is a copy of it and you're reading from it, then I will agree with you.
No,
But,
if you'd like, I can just show it to you. very
Okay,
quickly.
that'd be good. Yes, it says 50 nanograms may give an RFLP result.
But what you're saying is that based on your experience, that sometimes you can even get an RFLP result from as little as 25 nanograms?
Yes, actually, you could probably even go slightly lower than that, but it depends on the quality of the DNA.
Okay, and would you agree that, as evidenced by the banding patterns here, you are close to that minimal amount that you're talking about?
For item 52, yes, we're very close.
Okay, which would mean that somewhere in that 25 nanogram range, more or less.
Yes, that would be my estimation.
Okay. And would you agree that, a microliter of blood has as little as 20 to 40 nanograms of DNA in it, if it's in good shape?
To tell you the truth, I don't actually know what the correct figure for that would be.
Let me just show you something just to see if it refreshes your recollection.
Page, counsel.
Page 28.
Your Honor, I have an objection as to foundation at this point.
Sustain. Ask the question, counsel.
All right.
Go ahead and stay there. Ask the question.
Well,
Dr. Cardin, are you familiar with the NRC report?
Your Honor, I would do a whole series of questions if you'd like, and I'll do that now. Sorry. Dr. Cotton, what is the National Academy of Science?
It's an organization of scientists who have done very important work in their respective fields and been elected to become members of the National Academy of Science.
It would be fair to say that it basically includes the most distinguished members of the scientific community in this country.
Well, I don't know that it includes all of the most distinguished, but it includes a good many of them.
And in 1990, did the National Academy of Science commission a study on the reliability of forensic DNA profiling?
Yes, they did.
And did that study, to do that study, did the National Academy of Science appoint a committee to do the investigation?
Yes, I don't,
Objection is to relevance at this point.
A few more questions, Counsel. I'll overrule it subject to later motion, but let's get to the chase here.
And would you agree that some of the more esteemed members of the forensic science community and genetics community participated in this committee that eventually drafted a book?
I will agree with you that some of the members were very knowledgeable, but you may have overstated their standing somewhat.
Okay. In fact, you personally testified before this committee, did you not, before this report was prepared?
Testimony wouldn't be my choice of words. I didn't take any kind of oath or anything. I just gave a short talk.
And the participants asked you questions as well?
Yes, they did.
Okay. And to the best of your knowledge, this report was funded by, in part, the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Hearsay and relevance at this point.
Overruled.
I believe that was where some of the funding came from, and some came from other sources.
Such as the National Institute of Health and other
Yes.
government agencies?
Yes.
And eventually, in April of 1992, the National Academy of Science Press published their final report. Isn't that right?
That's right.
And no doubt you have carefully, I think you even said on direct examination, that you have read this report many times.
I have.
And whether or not you agree with all of its findings, Dr. Cotton, would it be fair to say that you have considered all that is written in this book before reaching your own opinions?
Well, excuse me. Objection vague.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
All right.
Let's narrow it down.
Fine. Have you considered the conclusions and observations in this book as part of the process of reaching your own opinions about the reliability of forensic DNA profiling?
Same objection.
Sustained.
Well, the book has a number of chapters, does it not, Dr. Cotton?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And have you considered the chapter entitled DNA Typing Technical Considerations as part of the process in reaching your own opinions and conclusions about forensic DNA profiling?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Do you mean have I thought about what they said?
Yes.
Certainly, I thought about it.
And now I'm going to ask you exactly the same question with respect to Chapter 3, which is DNA Typing, Statistical Basis for Interpretation. Have you thought about what they said as well?
Yes.
And have you thought about what they said in Chapter 4, entitled Ensuring High Standards?
Yes.
Fine. Okay, now, in that Chapter 2, I'd like you, which you said you did think about and consider in reaching your opinions and conclusions, I'd like...
Objection misstates the evidence.
No, it doesn't.
Sustained. It does. Rephrase the question.
With respect to Chapter 2, that you have acknowledged thinking about and considering, I'd like to ask you about a particular table, Table 1.1.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Same objection.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Is this still a foundation?
Yes. comments here, counsel?
Dr. Cotton? And you said a moment ago that you thought about the contents of each of those specific chapters which I referred to. And did you consider the contents of those particular chapters which I just referred to in formulating or coming to your own conclusions and opinions, whether or not you accept or reject the contents of those chapters?
Sustain.
Dr. Cotton, did you consider the contents of Chapter 2 in formulating your own opinions? One second. In formulating your own opinions regarding the technical considerations for DNA typing?
Overruled.
I read that chapter. I thought about what it had to say. I don't agree with all the things that are in the chapter, but I certainly thought about them as I read them.
And when you thought about them as you read them, even if you didn't agree with, by the way, are there some things in the chapter which you do agree with?
That would be applied to the whole book. There are things that I agree with, and there are things that I don't agree with.
Fine. But in helping you to reach your conclusions and your current opinions, did you at least consider the positions taken in those 3 chapters that we just described?
Sustain.
I don't think that.
Sustain.
Oh.
All right, we'll go through it chapter by chapter again, Your Honor. Have you considered,
Counsel, I indicated to you as clearly as I could, the issue is reliance in forming an opinion. The fact that you read something doesn't necessarily mean that you can be cross-examined on it.
I
Has to be the basis of an opinion. Proceed.
forming your opinion that you've given to this jury in this case, did you consider the substance of what appears in Chapter 2, DNA typing technical considerations?
Same objection.
Overruled. You can answer that yes or no.
No.
Didn't consider it at all?
If you're asking me, did I consider that chapter in forming my opinions that I've presented regarding this evidence, I have to say I did not.
Well, when I say that, let me clarify that. Did you consider this chapter in formulating your opinions on the technical considerations of DNA typing in general, which of course is one of the things that well, let me back up. Are the technical considerations of DNA typing one factor that you consider when you assess evidence in a case?
Overruled.
course.
And on a foundation or threshold level, Dr. Cotton, in coming to your own conclusions and understanding about the various technical considerations involved in forensic DNA profiling, did you consider what the National Academy of Science report said in this book, DNA Technology and Forensic Science?
Same objection, Your Honor. And asked and answered.
Overruled. Yes or no?
No.
One moment. May we please have a sidebar? I might save some time.
With court board, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Well, Dr. Cotton, just with respect to, I sort of forgot where I was, but,
I thought we were trying to establish the minimum thresholds for RFLP testing.
okay. Let me just ask you whether or not, looking at a particular chart would refresh your recollection as to how many nanograms of DNA is in a milliliter of blood. May I approach the witness, just for the purpose of refreshing her recollection?
Do you recall having seen a chart like that in the?
Yes, I do.
All right, would you go ahead and show it?
Thank you.
It was on page 28?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the page.
28.
The,
All right, the only issue is, does that refresh your recollection as to these items, Doctor?
yes.
All right, Ms. Neufeld.
Can I get out my copy so I can keep looking
Sure.
at it?
Go right ahead.
What page is the chart on again?
28.
28.
I'm ready.
So your own copy of the book entitled DNA Technology and Forensic Science?
Yeah, it looks just like yours.
Okay. And would it be fair to say, I think you said, in fact, that there are certain portions of this book that you agree with, and there are certain portions of the book you disagree with?
That's right.
And as to the portions of the book that you agree with, would it be fair to say that you have considered and relied on those portions, at least, in helping to develop your own opinions on forensic DNA profiling?
The portions I agree with, yes.
Okay. And now, so if I bring up a certain portion, I'm going to ask you at a certain point whether it's something you agree with or disagree with, so we can eliminate it immediately, all right, Dr. Cotton?
That'd be fine.
Good. All right. According to, by the way, do you agree with the numbers reflected in Table 1-1?
They seem to fit with what seems to be about right, yeah.
Okay. And would it be correct then, Dr. Cotton, in concluding there are approximately 20,000 to 40,000 nanograms of DNA in a milliliter of blood?
This, I don't know the answer to that question. This chart is talking about a stain of a square millimeter, and how that would relate to a given volume, I'm not sure.
No, I'm not looking at the stain portions of the table, Dr. Cotton. I'm asking you about the very first line where it simply says blood, 20,000
okay.
to 40,000 nanograms per milliliter. You see that?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay. So put stains out of your mind for a second, all right? And let's just focus on liquid blood. Is that a correct statement, more or less, that a milliliter of liquid blood has approximately 20,000 to 40,000 nanograms of DNA in it?
Your Honor, objection at this point.
Well, that's what's listed in the chart, and that seems to be, let me just think about it more for 1 second. That's probably the high end. I would be much more willing to agree with the 20,000. The 40,000 seems like a lot.
Okay. So let's assume that it's 20,000. Now, that's how much is in a milliliter. Now, a microliter is what in relation to a milliliter, Dr.
One
Cotton?
1,000th.
Okay. And a, to show you exhibit. Which is Defendant's Exhibit 1132. And this is already in evidence. Dr. Cotton, I have just one question from this board. If there is 20 nanograms approximately in a microliter, would you agree that a microliter of blood is the approximate size of this item that I'm pointing to? And if you can't see it well, please come down off the stand.
A microliter is a volume, and that looks like the head of a pin.
Have you ever heard the expression, Dr. Cotton, that a microliter of blood is approximately the same size as the head of a pin?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of pin you have.
Okay. Granted, have you ever heard that expression anyway?
I don't have any idea.
Would you agree that, in layman's terms, that a microliter of blood is a minuscule amount?
I certainly would.
And I think you said that it was your belief, Dr. Cotton, that there was approximately 25 nanograms of DNA in the lane that produced the order route for item 52. Is that correct?
Yes, I said 25, and this is just a very rough estimate on my part, but certainly it's going to be between 25 and 50 or 60.
Well,
It's not going to be, it's certainly not more than that.
Well, a little bit earlier, did you say, however, that it was your estimate that it was about 25 nanograms?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if 20 nanograms of DNA could appear in a minuscule amount of blood reflected in...
1132.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Save you the trip.
Defendant's 1132. If the Bundy drops, which in my hypothetical were completely degraded, were then subjected to that minuscule amount of blood, or slightly more, would that be enough blood to produce 25 nanograms of DNA?
If it was liquid,
It would be enough, right?
yes.
Okay. And when you say liquid, you mean wet?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. And
Well, excuse me, objection, Your Honor.
Sustain.
I'm sorry for the remark.
Curious to disregard thank yous and no thank yous.
I apologize.
It's all right. It's all right. I'm sure they know you didn't mean it in any bad way. But it is question and answer. Let's proceed.
Now, in my hypothetical, then, Dr. Cotton, if the Bundy, assuming that the Bundy drops did not come from Mr. Simpson, but were completely degraded in the process of collection and handling, and then were brought into contact with a minuscule amount of blood, such as reflected on defendant's exhibit, which is in front of you, 1132, it could produce the banding pattern that you see in item 52. Isn't that correct? In the hypothetical.
Objection, improper hypothetical.
Overruled.
In the hypothetical, and with my addition that it be about a microliter of liquid blood, the answer is yes.
Thank you. All right. In fact, Dr. Cotton, isn't it true that in your very laboratory, in the CACLD proficiency test that you described on direct examination, on one occasion, you had a very degraded sample brought into contact with another sample of DNA, and you only saw the banding pattern of the second sample of DNA. Is that true?
Are you referring to the first CACLD?
I am.
The way you stated it isn't exactly correct.
All right, let me rephrase the question, Dr. Cotton. Isn't it a fact that in that CACLD experiment, proficiency test, where one sample cross-contaminated another sample, you got a false positive result?
Yes, but that cross-contamination was by directly adding DNA inadvertently to the wrong tube. It didn't have anything to do with the starting samples.
Well, when it was added to the wrong tube, it was added to a tube where the DNA had totally degraded. Is that correct?
I don't actually know that. We don't know if that DNA was degraded or whether there simply just wasn't enough to see, just below the level of detection.
Okay. Well, let's assume either hypothetical. Either there wasn't enough DNA left in that sample to detect the pattern, or there wasn't enough DNA left in that sample due to degradation to detect the pattern. The false positive was created, was it not, by then, inadvertently or incorrectly, mixing with that DNA from a second source.
Yes.
And by doing so, your laboratory generated what we just referred to as a false positive. Isn't that right?
Yes, it is.
And in the example that I just gave you about what happened in your own laboratory, Dr. Cotton, had that not been a proficiency test, well, I'm sorry, let me step back a second. The way you learned that Cellmark had in fact created a false positive is because the people from the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors that ran the test wrote to you and told you that you got a false positive. Isn't that right?
That's right.
In other words, you did not know you had a false positive when you did the testing yourselves.
That's right.
And had it not been a proficiency test, Dr. Cotton, you would not have found out that you had gotten a false positive. Isn't that correct?
Objection calls for speculation irrelevant.
Sustained speculation.
If instead of it being a proficiency test, Dr. Cotton, a false positive result would have falsely implicated somebody, wouldn't it?
Same objection.
Sustained.
Well,
It's argumentative as well.
now, given the example that I gave you about the Bundy drops being degraded and then coming into contact with blood from the Rockingham samples. Oh, by the way, one other matter on that. There has been testimony that the reference sample of Mr. Simpson was also in the evidence processing room at the same time that these Bundy stains and Rockingham stains were there. Why don't you do...
Sorry, objection misstates the evidence also improper if it's part of a hypothetical.
Overruled.
Okay. If, in fact, that reference sample of fresh blood from Mr. Simpson, I'm sorry, by the way, one other fact. There's also been testimony that the reference samples of Nicole Brown Simpson and the reference sample of Ronald Goldman were not in the evidence processing room on June 14th, on that same day. If blood from the fresh reference sample of Mr. Simpson came into contact with those swatches from the Bundy drops, and, giving my hypothetical, they were completely degraded, could that cross-contamination also create the result that you saw in item 52?
Objection again, since facts not in evidence.
Overruled.
Of course it could.
Okay. Now, and if that type of degradation and cross-contamination occurred, Dr. Cotton, your laboratory would not be able to uncover it given your testing protocol. Isn't that right?
We wouldn't detect it, of course not.
In fact, I believe you said on direct examination that your controls are designed to make sure or to minimize the likelihood of cross-contamination inside your own laboratory. Isn't that right?
That's right.
But you cannot be held accountable for what types of cross-contamination occurred on a sample before it reaches your laboratory. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's, of course, out of our control.
And even if this sample that you got was divided up when it went to you and given not just to you, Cellmark, but given to 2 or 3 other laboratories, it wouldn't make a difference in their ability to uncover this earlier cross-contamination, would it, given my hypothetical?
Objection vague also assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Would it be fair to say, Dr. Cotton, that since your laboratory's protocol would not be able to uncover the fact that the samples had been degraded, then cross-contaminated, that this would also be true, given your knowledge of how other DNA laboratories function? It would also be true if this sample was divided in half, and half was sent to you, and half was sent to a third laboratory.
Hold on. Proceed.
Same objection, same grounds.
Sustained.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, it was brought out on direct examination that when some of these samples arrived at your laboratory, 2 defense experts, Dr. Edward Blake and Dr. Henry Lee, were present at the laboratory. Is that right?
That's right. They weren't present when the samples arrived, but they were present when the samples were opened up and the cuttings were made.
And even if Dr. Edward Blake stood and remained at your laboratory during the entire process of testing in this case, had the type of cross-contamination that I described in my hypothetical actually occurred, isn't it a fact that he would not have been able to recognize it either?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained. Also calls for speculations of what Dr. Blake can recognize.
Well, based on what you said, Dr. Cotton, isn't it true that there is no control in your laboratory that you use that would be able to discover or disclose that the original Bundy drops had been contaminated with Mr. Simpson's blood? Isn't that a fact?
Yes, of course.
And so doesn't...
That's the 3rd time we've asked that question.
And if you used, I believe on your chart you said that for an item 52 you looked at 5 RFLPs, is that right?
Yes?
Well, you wouldn't be able to discover that type of cross-contamination if you used 15 or 20 RFLPs, would you?
Of course not.
We can actually get rid of this. Can I just do it? This one there.
Mr. Scheck, which board is this?
This is 259.
Thank you.
Dr. Cotton, if you can't see, please step down a little bit. But given my hypothetical, Dr. Cotton, about degradation in the original Bundy samples and then cross-contamination either through the Rockingham swatches, which were Mr. Simpson's blood, or from the vial of fresh blood belonging to Mr. Simpson, given that hypothetical, if that happened, you would still get the same kind of frequency that you got for item 47. Isn't that correct? That wouldn't change the frequencies that you get.
It wouldn't change anything.
And given my hypothetical, even if all that occurred, Dr. Cotton, you'd still get this astronomical frequency that you have here for number 52, Bundy drop of 1 in 170 million, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And the same would apply to every single one of those Bundy drops. Isn't that correct?
If your hypothetical is suggesting that each one of those Bundy drops had fit in with your hypothetical and got contaminated in the way you suggested with enough DNA, yes,
For every single one of the Bundy drops, correct?
of course.
Thank you. You can have a seat. Turn it around. And in fact, Dr. Cotton, there's even less DNA in the Bundy drops 47, 48, 49, and 50 than there was observed in 52. Correct?
Yes.
So it would take even less cross-contaminating DNA to affect the PCR results in those samples than it would take to affect the RFLP result in item 52.
Yes.
In fact, Dr. Cotton, how much DNA do you need to do your PCR test, your DQ alpha test?
Depending on how degraded the sample is. If the sample's in very good condition, a half a nanogram, this doesn't necessarily have any meaning to anybody, but it's not very much. A half a nanogram will work. If the sample is degraded, then you'll require more, and the more degraded it is, the more DNA you'll require until you reach the point where you can't get a result.
Well, does the user's kit suggest that 2 nanograms of DNA be used for doing DQ alpha typing?
Well, that's what they suggest be used, but that's only one amount of the large possibility of amounts that would work.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that unlike 20 nanograms, which might be the size of a pinhead, that 2 nanograms is barely, if at all, detectable to the naked eye?
I don't know if it's detectable. It's obviously just 1/10 of 20.
Thank you. Sorry.
Nothing to apologize for.
right.
Proceed.
Now, again, going back to these numbers that you testified to at the conclusion of the direct examination, Dr. Cotton, I'd like to ask you a few questions about what the number is and what the number isn't. Would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that the frequency you put up there one second, Your Honor. Move the Bundy card. Would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that the numbers you put up, for instance, for item 52 of 1 in 170 million does not reflect the probability of Mr. Simpson's guilt or innocence?
Of course it doesn't.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that that number is not a probability that someone other than Mr. Simpson is in fact the source of a particular stain?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking me.
Well, It's not a source probability, is it, Dr. Cotton?
Or will, do you understand the question?
No, it's just a probability of any other unrelated. It's the probability that another person in a specific racial group would have that same pattern. It's not, isn't related to the source of the sample at all.
And so it wouldn't be a probability that Mr. Simpson was the person who bled at Bundy, right?
That's right.
And would you agree that the number tells us nothing at all about the probability of false or misleading matches due to errors in the collection or handling of samples?
The number doesn't say anything about the areas that you just mentioned.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that the number tells us or tells the jury nothing about the probability of false or misleading matches due to evidence tampering?
Same objection.
Or will,
Also irrelevant.
or will.
It doesn't say anything about anything except the likelihood of another random person having that pattern.
So if, in fact, Dr. Cotton, pursuant to my hypothetical, the matches were due to the combined effects of total degradation followed by cross-contamination with Mr. Simpson's blood, then those numbers would be irrelevant, wouldn't they?
They still mean the same thing, regardless of your hypothetical. I don't know how to answer your
They
question
wouldn't
other
have
than
the
that.
same value for the
Wait,
jury.
wait, let her finish answering the
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry.
They mean what they mean. They don't mean anything else.
And the number tells us nothing about the probability that the swatches were mixed up at the Los Angeles Police Department as well, does it?
Objection assumes facts, not in evidence.
Sustained.
Well, you testified, I believe, that the number, for instance, 1 in 170 million to 1 in 1.2 billion for the item 52 is your opinion of the estimate about how rare a particular DNA profile is in the population, correct?
That's right.
Now, hypothetically, again, I'd like you to just follow one more hypothetical, Dr. Cotton. I'd like you, well, let's actually, and there's one other frequency I want to ask you about, and that has to do with the frequency that you reported for the blood on the socks. And you said that the frequency of that particular pattern, I believe, ranges anywhere from 1 in 6.8 billion to 1 in 530 billion. Is that right?
I can look it up, but I'm willing to take your word for it.
And that number of 1 in 530 billion is merely your opinion of the estimate of how rare the particular DNA profile is that you observed on the blood stain from the socks. Is that right?
The number isn't an opinion. It's just the mathematical estimation of the frequency of that banding pattern in a particular racial group.
Well, it's your estimate.
It's our laboratory's estimate.
Thank you. Hypothetically, if we assume the socks have been examined for the presence of blood twice, once by a criminalist on the day he collected the socks at Mr. Simpson's residence, and then a second time on June 29th by other criminalists in the LAPD laboratory, and that examination on both occasions looked for and found no blood.
I'm sorry, objection, Your Honor. Argumentative in its beginning also misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
Well, assume the socks had been examined twice for the presence of blood and that no blood was observed. Now assume that the socks had been tampered with.
Same objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. Sustained.
May we have a sidebar, please?
Evidence doesn't support that, counsel.
1 second. assume that these socks, after they were collected, had been examined on June 29th for the presence of blood and no blood was readily observed. And assume furthermore that the socks had been tampered with and the blood of Nicole Brown Simpson smeared.
Objection, Your Honor, I'm sorry.
Your Honor, as to the second,
Sustained.
Your Honor, can I put forward a good faith basis?
Some
The
point in
sidebar?
time, not right now. See, we'll take it up at the first break. Proceed to something else.
Well, would it be fair to say, Dr. Codden, that there is no test in your laboratory that can answer the question when or how the smear of blood got on the socks?
Yes, that's exactly correct.
And if the blood had been put on the socks at some time subsequent to June 12th or June 13th, you would still give a number of 1 in 530 billion for the presence of the DNA pattern on those socks. Is that right?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Overruled.
Yes.
Now, would you agree that in analyzing DNA typing, there are various factors which can affect the strength or value of that evidence?
Objection vague.
Sustained.
Well, if the frequency of a matching genotype was 1, okay, in other words, everybody has it, then the evidence wouldn't have much value, isn't that right?
It would have 0 value.
Okay. If the frequency was such as that it was 1 in 5, it might have a little more value than 1 in 1. Isn't that right?
It would definitely have more value.
And if instead the frequency was 1 in a billion, it would have substantially higher value. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Now, would you also agree, however, that as laboratory errors become more likely in a particular laboratory, the value of that DNA evidence decreases?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, would you agree, Dr. Codden, that as laboratory error is more common in a particular laboratory, the statistical value of the DNA evidence decreases?
That's vague.
Same objection, same ground.
I believe you testified, Dr. Cotton, that you know of no scientific test that can tell the age of blood drops. Is that right?
That's right.
And so, one possible explanation for blood drops is that those blood drops could have been deposited. 1 second. One possibility is that those 5 Bundy drops could be old blood drops.
Yes,
They could have been deposited sometime other than on the night of June 12th.
I suppose that's possible.
Okay. And, of course, you have no idea what the probability is for that being true or not. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely none.
Okay. Put a question mark. And it would be also possible, given the hypothetical, that an error in crime scene collection and packaging could produce the same result that you have on your other chart. Isn't that right?
Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm going to object. It's argumentative at this point.
Sustained, it's vague. What type of mistake we're talking about?
Would you agree that if cross-contamination occurred when the various samples from Bundy and Rockingham were unpackaged and blood from the Rockingham swatches came into contact with the Bundy swatches, that that could produce the results that you have in your DNA testing?
Same objection.
I'll allow it, but we've asked this question already.
I understand, but it's all part of a foundation, Your
I
Honor.
understand. I'll allow the question, but I'm indicating to you, we've heard this question answered already.
I'll give you the same answer as before. If the amount of contamination was sufficient to produce the DNA results from one sample to the next, then of course that's possible.
And again, you have no idea what the probability is that that occurred.
Same objection, Your Honor. Over.
Of course I don't.
And with respect to cross-contamination, given the hypothetical, had the Bundy swatches come into contact the following day on the 14th with the fresh blood from Mr. Simpson's reference sample, that too could produce the results that you described a moment ago on your chart. Isn't that correct?
Sorry, Your Honor, objection,
Sustained.
improper hypothetical.
Sustained.
Well, didn't you say a moment ago that had the Bundy drops, I'm sorry, had the swatches from the Bundy drops come into contact with